Thanks for joining. You're going to learn how I mill, assemble, build custom railings, and even fix failing columns, all with a complete custom cedar balustrade assembly in this video. This project was necessitated by the condition of the exterior column. Visually, it looked horrible, but what I found was these cracks were fairly superficial. While fixing up the column, I couldn't leave the existing balustrade intact. It was a janky, off-the-shelf system, and I have too many woodworking tools that are collecting dust, so it's time to put them to use. Roughly 4 years ago, I redid the balustrades for the front porch. It really improved the curb appeal, and it was a spot any dog would be proud of to woof at his neighbors from. Luckily, I have some leftover pieces and rough stock, so the budget is going to stay low for this one, as it was covered in the previous phase. It actually only cost me about $50 in paint and prime, $50 in fasteners, and $14 for a new newel post. The balustrade components are all made from cedar 2x4s. The bottom rail was designed to shed water, which the large chamfer does. The top rail has a curved detail to be comfortable on the hands, and the balusters feature a stop chamfer detail, which suits the board and batten Century home. These are all leftover pieces that I brought to the shop to make copies of. It always feels weird to joint a 2x4 because it's usually a rough carpentry item, but it's step one for creating these pieces. Following this, I drew them up on the table saw. I'm using a 3/4 inch round over bit to achieve the handle detail. I finish up the handle detail with a slight undercut on the table saw. The bottom rail chamfer is achieved super easy just on the table saw at a 45-degree angle. With the top and bottom rails roughed out, I can turn my attention to the balusters. The 2x4 dimension lends itself well to producing 2 balusters per length. I joint and then I go to the bandsaw to rip them in half. I'm trying to keep the cost down, so I'm utilizing some of my sample pieces which are too short to use for top and bottom rails. I'm going to tear those apart and turn them into balusters as well. Once milled to the final dimension, I cut all the balusters to length. Once cut to final length, I use the router table to achieve the stopped chamfer detail. I set up a stop block at the front and back of the router fence. These locations determine where the router bit will start and finish the cut. These are old jigs that I'm repurposing for this setup. While running the piece, you just walk it in slowly from the side, butt up to the back stop block. Then you push it along the fence until you hit your stop block at the front. The detail gets repeated on all 4 sides. It's a beautiful day, so we're having class outside today. I'm using a stain blocking primer to prep the cedar, which will prevent any of the bleed through from the resin and the knots. And I follow up with 2 coats of the finish paint. The column was in pretty rough shape. It had several cracks that would fluctuate seasonally, and I aimed to fix it by clamping it back together and laminating with epoxy. When I started, I thought this might be assembled like staves of a barrel, but it's actually a solid piece of wood, which I was pretty happy about. The epoxy in this case ended up being more of a filler than something holding it together. I used a few screws fastening from the side to combat future cracking. Once the column repairs were complete, a few rounds of paint cleaned it up nicely, and we can finally move to some noticeable progress on the install. I'm always trying to make my tolerances too tight, so I creep up on my finished length with a rasp. Once I'm happy with the fit, I repeat the process for the top rail. I actually have no idea what these pieces are called. I like to know architectural terms, so if you know, fill me in. But these pieces connect the top and bottom rail to the balusters. I'm going to call them subrails for this video. I've already figured out the layout for my balusters, and I did that by measuring the overall opening between the columns, subtracting the thickness of all my balusters, and I usually guess how many is the right number. With the remaining number, I divide by the number of spaces between balusters. And as long as I come close to, but not exceeding 4 inches, I've met code requirements without making it look too crowded. Each baluster gets held in place to the sub rail with 2 brad nails and a screw. Top and bottom rails are fastened to the column with trim screws. The sub rail gets fastened with trim screws to the top and bottom rails. Overall, I'm pretty happy with the first balustrade, and I'll come back later for caulking at the joints and touch-up paint. My next section of balustrade doesn't have a column, so I'm installing a newel post, and I want to attach it to the stair stringer for support. I use my combo square to find the inside edge of the stringer, and use another speed square to make my mark from there. From there, I know I'm working with a 4x4 newel post, so I make my marks accordingly. A pilot hole, jigsaw, and pocket boy make quick work of the opening.
Can't unscrew them. They're all old. They're not moving nowhere.
With the opening made, I can place the rough newel post in situ and make my marks. I used a scrap 2x4 to keep the piece elevated from the floor so it avoids dry rot in the future. I add a beveled crown detail to the top of the post, and I borrow the stop chamfer detail from the balusters so they all speak the same aesthetic language. Cutting into the tread for the newel post has actually created a structural problem to resolve. The tread is now unsupported as it no longer lands on the stair stringer. In order to resolve this, I'm adding an additional blocking below the treads. I'm using a 2x4 to span from stringer to stringer, and then adding another 2x4 perpendicular, which will pick up the weight of the compromised tread. The additional blocking also provides plenty of support for the newel post when fastened to. This is the little 2x4 scrap I use for placing the post. Once the post is fastened, I remove it to prevent moisture buildup. Once plumbed, the newel post gets fastened to the stringer with 2 structural screws. I follow up with fastening the post to the newly placed blocking underneath the treads as well. The next balustrade section is pretty similar to the first, except the angle adds some more complexity to the process. I use a coping saw to try and make the compound and curved cut. I end up using the rasp to do a lot more of the work than I really care to admit to you guys. You ever go to grab something and totally forget what you were looking for? Oh yeah, screws. Having a young family means these projects get drawn out over days, and you have to make do with the time you're given, and that means working in the rain sometimes. After this screw, a little caulk and touch-up painting, we are done. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this video interesting or helpful, please consider subscribing. And as always, hit the like button. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.